All right, so this is presentation 2 over Africa, and this one we're going over history. And it's not, of course, as detailed as European history, so it doesn't take quite as long. Then a couple of just review questions that you should know. Hit real quick. So Africa is a large plateau. We talked about that in presentation 1, how it sits at about 1,000 feet above sea level. It's pretty flat across the continent. And then the Nile River flows through, and that's going to be Uganda, Sudan, and Egypt. So it flows north out of Lake Victoria into the Mediterranean Sea. And then rift valleys are all the above. So diverging tectonic plates, they're in East Africa. We talked about the Great Rift Valley, and of course where Lake Victoria is, that's what actually formed the lake. And then a resource that made Africa appealing to European colonizers, of course, is going to be gold. Obviously, they're going to want that. And then the most important economic activity in Africa, and we talked about that one at link 2, is agriculture. And then the percentage of Africans that earn their living from farming is, of course, 66%. And we talked about how that's really hard for them considering there's not a lot of arable land, and they use a lot of the land for cash crops, and so that's what leads to issues with hunger. And then what best describes Africa's climate, and that's going to be dry and hot deserts, warm tropics, and snow-capped mountains. Of course, snow-capped mountains is the few mountains they have, but a lot more snow-capped, like Mount Kilimanjaro. And then desertification, you definitely need to know all about that. That's both A and C occurring in the Sahel. So remember, that's the region where the Sahara is expanding, and then sped up by human processes, and we talked about those as well. So let's get into the history of Africa. So we'll start, of course, with early history, but we'll hit all the same kind of time periods that we did with Europe. So let's start with part 1. So get into ancient time period. So you go back, 7,000 years ago. You see the Neolithic Revolution take place in Egypt. So remember, that's going from hunting and gathering to farming and food producing, and domesticating animals. That begins mainly along the Nile River region in Africa, especially in the delta, this area where the river expands out into many branches, and this is very fertile land. And so this is where early farming is going to start, and of course, it's going to bring rise to the Egyptian civilization, the Egyptian Empire, which lasted around 2,000 years or so. So of course during this time is when they built the pyramids about 4,000 years ago, and created the Egyptian civilization. So just knowing that the Nile River is what provided life for the civilization to even exist in the first place. So they were the most powerful civilization at that time period in history, Pharaoh being the ruler. And they lasted a long time because of the barrier of the Sahara Desert, blocking people from invading. And so it wasn't until sea invaders came, and then also people with chariots came in and started attacking Egypt that it was weakened, but it took a really long time to get to that point. And then from about 2000 BC, remember BCE is the same thing as BC, and then CE is the same thing as AD. So from 2000 BC to 1000 AD, we see, obviously that's a huge time period, 3,000 years, but during that time period we see this diffusion of the Bantu people. So Bantu people were mainly located in Central Africa, and then over time they began to expand and migrate throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Remember, sub-Saharan Africa is all of Africa that's below the Sahara, south of the Sahara Desert. And so the Bantu people originally had one language, and as they expanded, these languages changed, but they all are from the same family group, so they're all Bantu. As far as why they migrated, we don't really know, but of course we can make some educated guesses, such as lack of food, overpopulation, which would encourage the lack of food, not enough food to provide for everybody, maybe herds moving, things like that, warfare, water, all that could cause movement. But one of the main things that happen, though, you need to know is just that diffusion of language, the breakdown of languages. So these groups aren't going to really talk with each other much anymore as they expand. Then we get to the classical time periods, 1000 BC to 500 AD. So during the time of the Roman Empire, basically, for the most part. So we see trading empires in North Africa. So these are all based on certain products they have in trading across over to Europe or over into Asia. So your first one is the Carthaginian Empire, and they were destroyed by the Romans in the Punic Wars. I mentioned the Carthaginian Empire when I talked about Hannibal when we went over Europe, and I talked about him coming from North Africa and going into Spain and then going across the Alps and attacking Italy. And so Rome destroyed him in the Punic Wars and got rid of the Carthaginian Empire. And after that, you see Axum, and then they're pretty much along this area right here, Red Sea going into the Indian Ocean. Great connection there. Roman Empire came just right north of that area, and so they would trade with the Roman Empire going up across the Mediterranean and of course across North Africa and then over into Asia as well. And then you get some of the other empires in Western Africa, Northwestern Africa. These trading empires are going to be Ghana, Great Zimbabwe, Mali, and Songhai. And you don't really need to remember their names. You need to remember more so this part here, spec. You need to know about these empires and kind of how they were set up. So the gold salt trade is the main thing that kept these going. And most of these were Muslim, except Great Zimbabwe is animistic. You need to know that term. So that means like worshiping like animal spirits, nature spirits, stuff like that. Kind of like Native Americans is another way to think of it. So socially speaking, that's what S stands for, socially. They were patriarchal, meaning that the eldest man in the family was the one who controlled the family in these societies. And there was a big income gap as well. So you had a few rich people and a lot of poor people. There was really no in between. And politically speaking, these were monarchies and they were dynastic, meaning like a family would rule and then, control the seat of power for a long time. And a lot of these were theocratic, meaning that the religion, of course, controlled the state. All the Muslim ones were that way, and even the animistic ones are going to be that way as well. And then economically speaking, mainly into mining, smelting, ivory, salt. Like I said, the gold salt was really the most important part of it. Not gold salt, but gold and salt. And then, of course, tariffs and stuff and taxes because goods are going in and out and going through these empires. So they're going to put tolls on them. And then, of course, slaves. So before in Africa, the Africans enslaved other Africans, and then the Muslims came in and enslaved Africans. They're the first outside group to enslave them. But they treated them generally better than what we saw here in the Americas. So, like, you could get your freedom. You weren't born a slave, and stuff like that, like it was here. And then culturally speaking, going into slavery, of course, again. So one ethnic group may enslave another ethnic group, of course, creates that tension between the different ethnic groups within Africa, and then, of course, outsiders coming in and enslaving them as well. But we still see slavery in Africa today. And then this map just shows where the different empires were and the trade routes going across the Sahara, connecting them. All right. As far as pretty much everything else going on, they're mainly stateless societies throughout sub-Saharan Africa. You don't see elected governments. It's just family lineage kind of controlling everything. So that's what's happening in the rest of Africa, below the Sahara. So below the Sahara, sub-Sahara, did not advance as quickly as Northern Africa because North Africa had connection to Europe, the Middle East, East Asia, South Asia, and all that. Whereas in sub-Saharan Africa was kind of left out. And so they're not going to pick up as quickly. All right, now part 2 of history, early modern into the newest stage of history. This is really about colonialism in Europe maintaining control of Africa. So the first thing, this should be a review of U.S. history. You should know about triangular trade. Remember that from last year. But of course, we'll recap it. So you get to the age of exploration. Of course, at first, they're trying to get to India, to get to that trade route to India. So the Portuguese, they moved down along the coast of Africa and set up trading posts, as they go around Africa over to India. And then eventually, once they discover the Americas, they realize there's a lot of places here they can farm and produce raw materials to fuel the Industrial Revolution that's occurring in Europe. And so, of course, they want free labor, and the best place to get free labor was Africa. And so they would take Africans, bring them over to the Americas to produce the raw materials. Raw materials would then go over to Europe where they would create the manufactured product. So let's say they grow cotton over here, you take it over to Europe and they make shirts and stuff. And then sell it, within Europe, and then sell it over into the colonies that they own. And then they would go down here to Africa, and then they would trade things like rum, guns, things like that in exchange for more slaves to bring back over here to the Americas to work on the raw materials to help fuel the Industrial Revolution and manufacturing in Europe. So that's the relationship there with the triangular trade system. And so down here is just another way it would work sometimes. So produce sugar, like in the Caribbean, the sugar would go up to New England. There they would make things like rum and stuff like that. And then that would go down to Africa, and then they would trade that for more slaves. So sometimes it would just bypass Europe, especially with rum. So you produce the rum in the Americas, take it back to Africa, get more slaves, bring more slaves, produce more sugar, make more rum, get more slaves, and then produce more sugar, make more rum, get more slaves, and it's just on and on. And so remember, of course, the big picture of what's going on here. The main reason for doing this, what fueled slavery, is the Industrial Revolution. They wanted to make as much money as possible, and the best way to do that, they thought, was to have free labor. And so that maximizes your profit margin and just ensures you make a lot more money. And then, of course, the African chiefs, and this is key, they benefited from the slave trade. So remember, Europeans did not actually go into Africa and take the slaves for themselves. Chiefs caught their own people or other ethnic tribes they didn't like and caught them and then sold them into slavery. And then, of course, they become basically warlords because now they have guns and a lot of power. And then, of course, keep in mind what this is going to do to the societies they're trying to control. You're taking the strongest men out of the society, 18 to 35 years old. You're leaving women, children, and the weaker men. And now you have guns, and so it's really easy to control the populations there as well. And so that's why they were willing to make that trade. And then the Atlantic slave trade, and some details about this. This was horrific, lasted 300 years. 12 million people are traded across the Atlantic, and a quarter of them die. Obviously, again, Africa is severely drained of human resources, meaning people. So socially damaging. Think about it's going to damage the families. It's going to damage their economic production. It's going to damage the psyche of the people, all kinds of things. And then, of course, Africa is now dependent upon European trades and goods to be able to survive. And you need to know, of course, basically how the Africans were treated on the Atlantic slave trade. So, it was absolutely horrible. You had tightly packed ships, which layered people in stacks pretty much up to the ceiling underneath the ship. People were naked, laying on top of each other. You had to go to the bathroom where you were laying. You may have been whipped earlier that day or something like that. You may have open wounds and getting, human waste in there. And then, some slaves may refuse to eat, and so they'd use a device to force their mouth open and shove food down their mouth. It was absolutely horrific. Hence why 3 million people died going across the Atlantic. Then you had your lightly packed boats, which are still bad, obviously, but a little bit better conditions. But of course, the main thing is to get as many slaves to market as possible in as good a condition as possible. The slave trade ended before slavery ended because of how horrific it was. And keep in mind, people were still racist. It was just, even though people were racist, they still had at least some sense to realize that, okay, this is beyond, what is allowable. Even if it's to a race that at the time people deemed as inferior in Europe. All right, and then so the Europeans, after the slave trade ends, early 1800s, they had to switch gears. Okay, now you can't take slaves out of Africa, so what do? So what the Europeans do is they go into Africa and basically force the Africans to work there. So instead of taking them out, now you're forcing them to work in Africa because Africa has gold, they have diamonds, they have tons of other resources. And so European countries, mainly France, Great Britain, Belgium, Spain, Italy, Germany, Portugal, move in and start taking over different parts. But now the problem is European countries are going to start competing against each other because they're not going to have a fair amount. Some may have more land than others. And of course, it's not like this land is all equal in its natural resources. And so even if you have a lot of land, you may not have that much as far as natural resources go. And so it's going to create competition among these European countries to the point to where they may go to war, which worries a lot of European countries to the point to where they have a conference in Berlin, the Berlin Conference, 1884. You need to know this. This is huge because it still has an impact on Europe, or Africa today, and a lot of the problems we see in Africa. So to prevent a war in Europe, European leaders met in Berlin, took out a map of Africa, and just started dividing it up, drawing countries and territories out, and divided it up among the European countries. And the whole point was to avoid a war in Europe. And so the idea is that if we divide the natural resources up evenly with the European countries, there's no reason for them to fight each other. Now, of course, when they do this, they're not thinking about Africa at all, or the ethnic groups in Africa and who gets along with who. So they just throw groups together that don't like each other. But Europeans could care less. And this is going to create, again, a lot of the setup for the hostility we see today in Africa. So they divide up Africa, and of course, the main thing here is that they don't consult Africans about it. And of course, the other thing is this doesn't even work. So this still get World War I. The British and Dutch also fight over South Africa, so you still get wars fighting over different regions. So it didn't actually do its intended purpose. They still fight over control of Africa. And still, the economic pattern now, instead of taking slaves from Africa over to the Americas and producing the raw materials and then taking those to Europe to produce manufactured products, now it's just Africa and Europe. So you have Africa producing the raw materials sent to Europe. Europe produces a manufactured product, sells it within Europe, and then goes back to Africa and may sell some things to them as well. And that's pretty much the relationship there. So Africa is dependent on, it's like the whole continent was enslaved by European countries. All right, so then the strategy, and this is key too to know, is how Europeans ruled these African societies. So what they did, instead of Europeans sending in other white people to control these areas, they took local elites, people kind of like the chiefs that would trade slaves. They would take those kind of people and bribe them and give them power and put them over the rest of the people in that society. So that way, the people that are being oppressed, their anger isn't going to be directed at the European power behind it. It's going to be directed at the local elites that are put in control. They've been bribed or seduced by the Europeans. And so that's what's going to create the Rwandan genocide. You got two groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis, that were created by the Belgians. Those ethnic groups didn't even exist beforehand. The Belgians put the Tutsis over the Hutus. Tutsis made up 20% of the population. Hutus made up 80% of the population. And the Tutsis, with direction from Belgium, treated the Hutus horribly to keep them under control. And of course, when Belgium left, they put the Hutus in power and didn't set up any kind of fail-safes or anything to protect the Tutsis. So Hutus take over. They want revenge, and they go after the Tutsis and try to wipe them out. And we'll get into that later. All right, so... And then Europeans, as far as investment goes, only invest in infrastructure to help get to the raw materials. So any roads they built or anything like that only went to help them get access to their natural resources. They didn't do anything to build like hospitals or schools or anything like that that would help the society overall whatsoever. All right, so this last part is just a little discussion we did in class, basically over the slave trade and who it benefited, and who. Was it an advantage for Europe or advantage for Africa, disadvantage for Europe, disadvantage for Africa? I won't go over it on this. So that's pretty much it. But especially know more of the modern stuff. The modern part of this history is really important. So understanding that the relationship between Europe and Africa, and of course the reasons for the slave trade, and then how Europe treated Africa after the slave trade ended with taking over Africa. The Berlin Conference, of course, is huge, understanding that relationship and how that's going to set up conflicts today with just random drawing of borders across the continent. And then also, of course, them using local elites to control the area. Because, again, that's just all that stuff is setting up the problems we see in Africa today. So just understanding of the relationships between those things. And then, of course, the big picture behind it economically. What was the reason Europe was doing this in the first place? What was driving the need for slavery? What was driving the need for access to these raw materials? So understanding the Industrial Revolution and the need for raw materials to be able to fuel the Industrial Revolution in Europe. So just understanding all those pieces, how they all interconnect and work together to form this horrific history.